Um, Fab. Welcome everyone to January's talk from the public policy design community. Really exciting one. As a kind of starting point, I'm just going to pass over to Andy, who is the leader of the community, to briefly introduce what the community is and what it looks like. So over to you, Andy.
Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to this event. This is a policy design community event. My name's Andrew Knight. I head up the community. We are UK Civil Services Centre of Excellence for Design. We're sponsored by the policy profession, but we also work closely with operational and digital delivery professions as well. And our mission is to make design core business for governments. We've built a design community of over 1,000 members inside government and a further 2,000 outside in private practice and design research in universities from across the globe. And as a group, we advocate for design through events like these and our blog. And we also develop design capability. We're putting together a design school this year, and we create design infrastructure, such as finding ways to report the value of design to our colleagues. So if any of that sounds interesting to you and you're not a member already, we'd love for you to join. I'll just put the link to our page in the chat in a mo. And finally, big thank you to Indy. Can't wait to hear what you've got to say today. Thank you very much for coming. And I'll hand back to Thomas, who's going to shepherd us through the event today. Cheers.
Thanks, Andy. So yeah, we're really excited to have Indy speaking to us today. Many of you might know him already, but just as a quick introduction, Indy is an architect by trade. He is the co-founder of Dark Matter Labs, who are very cool. Check out the work they're doing. He's also a professor at RMIT University in Melbourne, and he's going to speak to us a little bit about his work today. Before I pass over to Indy, as a little bit of housekeeping, Indy will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll work through questions after he's finished. Definitely put questions in the chat as we go, and I'll keep an eye on them to ask Indy at the end of his talk. And as a last point, definitely encourage everyone to keep their cameras on so Indy can see who he's speaking to. And definitely when it comes to questions, if you could put your camera on, that'd be fab. So yeah, without any further ado, I'll pass over to Indy.
Thank you. Personally delighted and honoured to be here, and thank you for everyone's time. I'm going to quickly, over 30 minutes, just kind of lay out an arc of some of the things that we're seeing at Dark Matter Labs, and hopefully it can open up a series of questions as to what many of us are working on and some of the kind of critical practices in that conversation that are emerging. So just a bit of preface on where I'm at. A little bit about Dark Matter Labs. We're a not-for-profit organisation rooted now geographically, operating from South Korea to Canada. We started off in London, but have grown. The highest paid to lowest paid is 2-to-1 ratio between the highest paid to lowest paid of the organisation. We don't just have designers per se, or we think everyone is a designer. We have all the way from kind of finance structuring capabilities to governance to international law capabilities. So what we're building is a polymathic capability to be able to do some of the work that we're doing. And I think for me, that opens up a really inherent question about sort of how do you operate in a polymathic environment and what does that drive? And that's driven all sorts of our internal organizational questions, pay questions and other things, and transformed us in some ways. We don't hardly ever do RFPs, requests for proposals, just to say, because we find that actually by the time an RFP is written, the presumption of the answer is already understood. and thereby it becomes kind of irrelevant in that process. So most of our work is done in partnership with, and we grow projects in relationship with our partners, and that can go from with very large institutions like UNDP, or to other forms of institutions like, you know, the Net Zero Cities program, which we built with Climate Kick, has now effectively grown into an initiative which is working with the European Commission to deliver sort of 116 cities in their transition. So we try to act, we're sort of mission orientated, and we build in partnership with. We're largely focused on the dark matter, but I'll get onto that at a later point. So just in terms of the focus of this period, like, I suppose one of the things that I'm finding particularly important is that there is a gap emerging between what I think we want the future to look like and the scale of the transition that we're most likely to face. And we think there's been a sort of there's a really interesting question about what does the scale of the transition in the next 10 years look like, and what is the scale of transformation that it will demand. And, you know, one of the things that's becoming very clear, and I think Andrew and I were talking about this yesterday, is that a lot of government is focused on the act of maintaining and preserving, whereas in a moment of great transformation, actually the role of government may be more than just acting and preserving. It becomes significantly about the synthesis of the new, and the capabilities to synthesize new actually challenges many things. And it's not just synthesis of new at the product and services level. It might be synthesis of new at a functional level, at a capabilities level, all the way through to quite a different theory of actually how value is constructed. So it's quite a deep structured transition. I want to start here because I think there's a sort of one of the things I found sort of the most challenging is about maybe about a year and a half ago, we started to look at what a 3-degree world would look like. And there's a piece of work that we did with Civic Square looking at 3-degree futures. And this was just precursor to, you know, the IPCC coming out and saying this was the most likely scenario, or the head of the IPCC coming out saying this is the most likely scenario. And it was also, and what I think is scary and interesting is that many, many people now believe this to be the likelihood that we're operating into, that we have almost certainly lost 1.5 degrees and we are now operating in a 3-degree future. And I think this is massive in terms of implications. One of the kind of, there's a lot of data, but there's also some really interesting counter data on this. So 3-degree global average means 5 degrees on land, means 8 degrees in summer in urban environments. So that's what implications are in terms of actually 3-degree global average. And I'm not including volatility of weather, we're not including precipitation rates, we're not including sort of any form of like wind issues, we're not including second order effects like agriculture. I'm just talking at a pure temperature level. And what that also means is that actually for the UK particularly, it can be a much broader range of issues. So if we lose the Mid-Atlantic current, the AMOC, we can actually become significantly colder because we're unusually warm for the latitude that we operate in. And that could be, we could be looking at a significantly colder environment. So the UK particularly is looking at a very high degree of expansion of the variability of temperature regimes that we could be operating in. And in that regime, how do we operate and what are the strategies and implications that we start to design into has significant implications. So about 2 years ago, every room I went into was basically talking about retrofit from a heating level perspective. Everyone's just talking about heating. Well, how are we going to replace our heating load with? And, you know, more recently, the conversation has become, well, actually, cooling load is a much more difficult problem. How are we going to deal with that? But actually, well, the real problem is that we're facing the whole spectrum of optionality that will probably, for a period, heat and then significantly cool. How do we operationalize into that reality? At the same time, what does that mean if you look at it from a global level? And this is kind of the work that was done by The Economist. So you start to see what this means in terms of moving habitable areas outside niche zones, like human niche zones. We're going to have a significant loss of inhabitable habitation environments. This is by 2070, and we've already seen the numbers. Some of these events occurring. Remember, these are sort of projections, but what you get is peaks and troughs will happen much earlier, and the variability will increase much earlier, and we're starting to see that already. And we also need to know that, wet bulb temperatures of about sort of 38 degrees or 36 degrees wet bulb temperatures, 100% humidity, effectively is the peak the human body can tolerate. So actually, this isn't about sort of 55 degrees. It's about wet bulb, high levels of humidity. We're seeing those extreme environments becoming more and more likely and happening. And what's also very clear is the kind of systemic resilience gap. And I use this because I think most of the conversations, certainly we're part of, is actually, and if you look at what is the finance and climate transition being used for, climate finance, you say most of it, virtually vast amounts of it, is being used for mitigation. Very low levels are being used for any form of adaptation or any form of resilience infrastructure spending. And we're seeing this is becoming, and the problem is our capital markets and our financial institutions aren't funded for resilience. No one is willing to pay. Our financial markets, whether our food systems, are optimized for the efficiency of capital, not the resilience of supply. So it is not the duty of the market to make sure that toilet paper is available regardless of bottlenecks. Right? I'm just using the bizarre COVID example. Right? So the question for us is, and certainly for policy designers, is that actually we've got a gap between our market is optimized for the efficiency of capital, not the resilience of supply. Whereas from a government perspective, the resilience of supply of foods, energy, water systems, critical systems is really vital. So we're seeing this security dynamic becoming a key driver in a lot of our transition logics right now. So across the conversation we're seeing is security, and security not in a bounded idea, boundary of the UK or boundary of London, but security from a sort of interest, from a systems idea, and also an entangled idea. And I sort of bring that up because I think this is going to be one of the big issues of how do we start to finance and structure and build the policy frameworks for building the resilience of the UK becomes really key. And you're seeing, national emergency trusts and various other things starting to be born, but our capacity to capitalize them, is that about the preservation of future GDP? So how resilient is future GDP of the UK? Are we going to be able to price that resilience and be able to use that as funding and investment to be able to build that resilience? The other thing I think is really important to sort of lay down is that the linkages are really critical. So climate breakdown means the loss of predictability and thereby drives the loss of insurability. And thereby without insurability, you lose capital markets. So you can't get a mortgage in Halifax, Canada, right? Many parts of Halifax, you can't get a mortgage for the house because the weather events that are becoming so consistent that you just can't get a mortgage. You can't get a mortgage because you can't get insurance, and thereby the house market is becoming purely about cash purchases. And in Australia, parts of Australia, you're seeing the insurance costs being basically the reconstruction cost of the house every year in parts of Australia. So what we're starting to see, and this is really important, this will drive massive inequality into the system, right? So inequality will, because actually assets can only be purchased by people that can self-insure, and effectively what we'll see is the concentration of asset base and the more vulnerability of and non-asset citizens becoming systemically vulnerable because our financial markets are operating on the preservation of assets and the optimization of assets. And I'm just bringing this down because I think one of the key goals of design is to be able to link across these disciplines, and to link across the financial discipline, link across the inequality discipline, link across the climate science aspects. It's the intersectional capacity of design is actually one of the key fundamental acts that I think we have to bring to the table. Now, again, I just want to keep bringing this. I think this is a really powerful quote in my view, and I'm going to materialize in a really simple way. So UK railways run on rails. Those rails are made of a particular steel that is focused on an expansion range, I think to up to about 39 degrees temperature centigrade in the summer to about -6 in the winter. Right? That's the range of expansion that it's designed for. Obviously has a little bit of tolerance. But as climate change happens, what we are having is our ranges of our primary infrastructures are being exceeded. Now, so it's not just climate change, it's these infrastructure maintenance costs and failure costs are starting to happen across our primary infrastructures. People are talking about it in terms of all sorts of other issues, whether it's the likelihood of breakages in wires, wiring, electrical cables, all sorts of things are starting to happen. So it's really important from the work we're seeing, is not just to look at the big catastrophic changes, but also the incremental maintenance costs and the transition costs that are accruing in the micro aspects. And this ability to link across these things and be able to sort of operationalize across them, it becomes really vital. And what are the solutions? Is it about replacement? Is it about making sure all railways are covered with tree line railways as a means to reduce that? Or does that mean there's an on-cost in terms of maintenance, cleaning and leaf coverage, all sorts of things? So what are the solution spaces that it opens up? So I think that was just about situating the conversation that we're starting to see, and what I think the kind of dimensions are that is, and a lot of our work is what I would call pre-politics, i.e. it is not in the political Overton window, but it is in the strategic risk windows that people are starting to have to perceive. So a lot of our work is saying, what are the strategic risks, and then you have to construct with politicians or political actors the politics around this stuff and build a social recognition around this. Climate breakdown, I think it's really also important to recognize that at a more structural level, climate breakdown is a symptom. Right? It's a symptom of a much deeper failure point. And why that's important is that you could argue that climate breakdown is a symptom of an economy designed for externalization and extraction. And the externalization was CO2, methane, so it's driving that externalization. That's unpriced in the system, and so on. And you could argue there's other forms of externalities. Most of us are, for example, have microplastics inside us. There's a whole bunch of other externalities, air pollution, that are yet unpriced in the system. And we have an economy designed for that externalization. One of the challenges I think we face is that fundamentally, when you start to look at it at the structural level, we're looking at a recoding of our economy, and a recoding of how value is constructed and what value looks like in the 21st century. And this arbitrage between what we value and what we price is one of the biggest structural transformations that we're in the middle of. And what we're seeing also is right now, across many of the countries that we work with, the political narratives, as our economies become more fragile for lots of different reasons, geopoliticization, the fracture of global commodity markets, all sorts of things, we're seeing also economies having to hunt growth. So we're seeing, and hunting growth is becoming imperative to preserving the welfare infrastructure of democracies and preserving the social contract. So there's a weird acceleration that we're seeing where the growth imperative is becoming an existential imperative in order to preserve the social contract in terms of the welfare cost infrastructure. And I think this is going to require quite a structural reimagination of how we organize value and where our economic models of value come from. And I'm just putting this down because these are the initial conversations we're starting to see emerge around what is our trajectory. And yes, some of you may be talking about degrowth, some of you may be talking about post-growth economies, and some of you may be talking about next growth or green growth economies. But I think there's a conversation about what that thesis looks like in a much more integral way, which is becoming quite critical. It's going to come at us quite quickly. The second point on that is that I think is worth us recognizing is, I love this diagram, right? Because it just sort of, when people talk about the Anthropocene, this is what they really mean, right? Where there's more cattle than people, right? There's more goats than wild animals, right? You realize that basically the world is a farm on which there's some zoos of wild animals in the world. And I think it's really important to perceive the planet now being almost entirely bioengineered, right? And I think so there's a sort of illusion, a romantic illusion of the wild that we keep falling back to. And there's a really interesting, it's sort of the realization that we're almost certainly all living in a synthetic, human engineered, bioengineered landscapes now. And when you go to a farm, there's nothing natural about it. It's an industrial landscape, highly polluted, highly biodiverse, massive loss of biodiversity in that environment. So I think there's something really critical, and we know certainly from the work we're seeing is that the food systems crisis is going to be one of the first food systems crisis. Is probably the first driver of climate breakdown effects, and it has massive social instability costs on that side of it. So I think, and that has got a whole new conversation emerging around what is the land economy of the 21st century? How do we position in that land economy of the 21st century in terms of rights and the hydrology of hydrological cycles of land, soil and carbon rights, who owns the carbon responsibilities, who owns the liability in terms of the governance of the microbiome and the soil quality. So I think we're going to see a whole new land economy conversation there. And this is, from our feeling, this is going to be one of the big first movers, driven partly both through a security lens, through a crisis lens, and actually the political lens. And I think this is a really important transition landscape. It's also just like just really important to recognize the energy conversation at the back end of this, which is that basically our civilization, and I would say our civilization as in the industrial civilization as opposed to the Western civilization, our civilization as a planetary civilization is largely a function of energy. Right? Simple. Complexity of civilization is a function of energy. And what we will find when we look at the energy infrastructure, what you start to see very clearly is that effectively we are in a massive transition in energy infrastructure, but that has major implications. So since 2019, you'll know that the US energy demand has been increasing. So it's not going down anymore. It was till then. It's been massively increasing, but both as a function of reindustrialization, but also as a function of data centers and other energy demand. So we're going to see energy is going to be such a big structural issue, and the cost of energy. And we're seeing parts of Sweden, for example, the reindustrialization of North Sweden, because the cost of energy is so low in terms of hydrological energy supplies. So we're going to see an economic geography shift of the world relative to energy provision, and that's going to shift industrial and heavy industry in different ways. So I think it's really worth just looking at some of these things. And a lot of this stuff you'll all know. What we're going to see is a massive, as we go from, everyone talks about renewables, but actually the reality is what we're doing is moving from a hydrocarbon economy to a mineral-driven economy. And there's a vast increase in the net minerals that are required. Though I think what it is worth recognizing is this figure, is the tonnage. I think this is per tons relative of the amount of fossil fuels we burn every year and the amount needed of materials. Now, the only thing that I want to just make very clear here is copper, copper ore, for example, used to be 40% pure of copper. Now it's 0.4%. So for every ton of copper we need 4,000. We dig up 4,000 tons of ore to get to a ton of copper. Right. So actually that figure of yearly amount needed has to be multiplied by 1,000 factor for copper. So, and why this is important is this: most of our environmental damage is done by our material economy and the material economy needs. So we've got this conflict emerging between our material economy demands and our environmental demands and the stability issues. And what we're seeing also is that the geopolitical risks are starting to manifest in many of our supply chains. I think the UK government did a piece of work to look at the kind of system mapping of sort of a lot of the critical industrial supply chains. And what we're starting to see is the risks starting to emerge in lots of different ways, in lots of different frameworks around any one of these components and what they throw up. And I think so the geopoliticization of our global economy is going to change the very nature of it. Some would argue, and I'm not being political at all, the new administration in the US seeking Greenland is because of its rare mineral capacities, which is a critical existential requirement from a US perspective in terms of its ability to preserve its economy independent of China. So what you're starting to see is these geopolitical frames starting to actually materially manifest. Our economy is materially manifesting geopolitical demands in different formats. And what we are also seeing is that the turbulence, and this is, I think, really important, is the turbulence of this transformation is also starting to drive so energy costs, food costs, and other things. So why I think this is important is that I think volatility will increase, and volatility actually creates price exponential price increases. So a small amount of volatility has a much higher impact on price than actually, so it's not a proportional linkage. So there's something really important about how do we operate in a volatile landscape, and how do you preserve. More and more the conversation we're talking about is like what I'd call food mix. Sort of like we talk about energy mix, how do you build a food mix economy which can give you the resilience and the baseline costs in different ways? What does that look like, and how do we operationalize it? So I'm just putting some of this stuff down as context, and I will sort of within 10 minutes sort of bring this to a close so we can have a bit of a conversation around some of this stuff. So I think it's worth recognizing the constraints. I think one of the things that we have not often designed into the world of is what are the constraints that we're operating in, and whether it's carbon constraints, material constraints, climate breakdown effects, labor. You know, I think I was in a conversation certainly. One of the big challenges that we face, certainly at the UK level, is that a lot of our construction labour is now being consumed by defence projects and also critical infrastructure projects. Actually, our construction capacity at broader societal level is very significantly diminished because of that. So we've got labour constraints, and we've got also the impacts of deglobalisation in this current industrial economy sense. Now, I'm going to sort of frame that out a little bit, because why is that important? One of the things we're seeing is that these constraint landscapes are not actively being managed and thought through at the local level. This is a piece of work we're doing again in Denmark, where we were looking at, you know, in the construction industry, how do you have to reduce 95% reduction, certainly from a European policies level by 2029 in terms of actually current emissions. The current legislation goes from 9.6 to 7.1, but what we have to get to is 0.4 by 2029. And I'm going to just show you very quickly, you know, and the isolated examples that we've got there on the bottom left actually get to some very extreme positions, but actually are nowhere close to the 0.4. And when you start to get to those 0.4 scenarios, you have to start to think so fundamentally differently. This is putting it into a UK context. You've got to go from a typical house having 150 kilograms of CO2 per square meter down to 6.3. Right? And this changes the economy of what we build. So the UK does not have one managed structural timber forest, just to give you an idea. And global timber supply is basically, this is a contested study, so I fully acknowledge that, but World Resources Institute contested study which said global timber supply versus concrete is 5% variant. So somebody tells me in the UK they're building a timber house, how valuable is that? So it's no longer sufficient to just look for solutions. It's going to require us to take a systems-oriented view. And just to put some pretty shocking numbers around it. So brick and mortar is 40.5 kilograms. So it doesn't work in this new target space. Rammed earth does work, but it excludes things like sort of all the mechanisms and materials required to build it, and you have to get to hempcrete construction to get to the right sort of landscape. This is the quantum or scale of transformation we're looking for in our material industry to be able to make that viable. I mean, we were involved in, and this is why solution space, this is why design is so important. When we will be working in retrofit and sort of whole scale retrofit since about 2018, whole city retrofit questions. And what became very apparent was that actually we've basically run out of carbon budgets to retrofit the UK economy, or the retrofit UK homes, because we would have to release, and this is one of the best retrofits in the UK, it's a zero carbon house in Birmingham, and it required 125 kilograms of carbon sort of per meter squared of investment, and it took 21 years to effect it, or will take 21 years to pull it back. We just don't have the carbon budget to blow up to pull that back. Remember, Netherlands has already exceeded its 1.5 degree carbon budget. Denmark has already done it as well. Most economies are at the limit of their carbon budgets. So we're just operating into that landscape. So I suppose the big point I'm trying to make is that we are facing a structural transformation of pretty much the foundations of our economy, whether it's sort of where we're going to have to shift our economy from being materially driven to being intangibles driven. We're going to have to shift it almost certainly to being focused on durability of our material base. We're going to have to drive it towards a biomaterial based economy. We're going to have to build a new human economy, which I think is being underplayed out. Because remember, I think we're living in the Engels pause where the return on labor is basically flatlined and the return on capital is accelerating, which is systemically increasing inequality. So how we build the new human development economy is going to be one of the critical functions that we're starting to see come up against all of our critical policy circles, rebuilding our food system based on some of the conversations that we have, and then building the biointegrity of our landscapes as a means to preserve that those other economies becomes quite a structural fundamental transformation. And underneath it all is obviously RNG infrastructure. So that sets some of the scene and scope conversations. So I think the next few minutes, I'm just going to pull in of some of the kind of stuff that we're starting to see on how to deal with this. I think one of the big questions we're seeing is supply and demand coordination simultaneously. Often policy tends to be focused either on supply or a little bit on demand, but actually often is both focused on supply side. What we think is you're increasingly having to act as a coordinator on supply and demand simultaneously. And that I think is, and the demand side is not just industrial demand, it's also the desire landscapes from citizens and other frameworks. And I think what we're starting to see is the capabilities to construct that are becoming really critical in terms of actually the demand, the supply, the investment community and the regulatory community. And how do you start to build that? What's the kind of mechanisms of doing that? There's a lot of work we're doing around city level trusts that are able to orchestrate these sort of intersectional changes and what does that require? But I think there's new types of institutions required to be able to orchestrate these transformations. I think the other thing that I think is really important is that what are the tools and mechanisms available to allow a system to transform? Often when we get into rooms, people end up doing portfolios, which has become common parlance in the systems community and the policy design community. And the portfolios are usually portfolios of solutions. And what we're finding is portfolios of solutions are snapshots of looking at a problem space. And what you end up having to do is build the capacity of the system to respond continuously to the problem space. So actually a portfolio of new capabilities is more critical than a portfolio of solutions. So what are the nature of solutions that we're looking at, whether it's industrial supply system or energy system transformation? How do you build that capacity in different formats? New forms of institutional logics are becoming really critical and are transforming those economies. This is a piece of work we've been doing around electric batteries and new forms of ownership and governance frameworks around them, where they're held public chain trust and leased to the material, which means that they can drive circularity and second use. So there's, I think, new institutional economies that are going to be critical parts of this new material economy that I think is undervalued and unplayed, and also opens up new ways of financing, but requires new forms of capability. I think other things that are becoming really critical are new types of provision, new types of infrastructure. So often the conversations that we're part of is looking at what I call products and services solutions. And we increasingly find the conversation is infrastructure scale solutions. So it's not the retrofit of a house, it's the retrofit of a whole city. And that changes the nature of how you organize and how you make decisions. I mean, we're right now in the middle of building a way of financing the democratic capacity of a city. And how do you finance a democracy bond? So even the sense-making capacity of the city can actually be built in a different way. So we're seeing this quasi-infrastructure scale operation becoming really critical. The other part that I think is becoming really vital is going from single-point optimization to multi-point optimization. So you'll have heard Elizabeth's work on multi-solving. I think we're going to have to do our investments strategically from a multi-solving perspective. So a tree canopy of a city not only deals with energy costs, not only deals with flooding risk, not only deals with civic participation, it deals with all of those issues in a bundled capacity. But that requires a new type of multi-solving capability and effectively alliance. And this is why I think some of the missions conversations that have been happening are a way to integrate across these multi-solving demands in different frameworks. And this is a lot of the work around, so how do you look at those multi-solving capabilities, how do you finance them? And this is all about recognizing, an urban tree is currently still a liability. If you were to look at its cooling effects, if you look at the flood risk management effects, if it's done well, you can start to see a whole bunch of benefits. But currently we only account for its insurance costs and its and its maintenance costs. So there's a really interesting accounting function in terms of being able to account for these capabilities in different ways, and also the spillover effects. This is the work we did in the on the High Line, where we looked at how sort of 140 million so it was 174 million of investment drove 3.48 billion of land value uplift. So 3.48 billion of land value uplift was attributable to the High Line as a result of sort of 174 million. So how do you capture spillover value? We did this obviously with sort of Elizabeth Line. I think there's a whole conversation about how we start to invest at that infrastructure scale for the pooling of collective risk, as well as the pooling of additional benefits. So it's going to be risk pooling. So captive insurance is going to become a key thing onto those frameworks. The other thing that's becoming really important is many of these solutions, so if you're looking at some form of retrofit, require you to effectively work at the intersection of supply chains, capabilities, to civic participation. And I think one of the big challenges that we think is that actually working across the system transformation capability is actually one of the kind of, and this is where the 3D designers can play a key role, working across these disciplines to be able to coordinate system level capabilities. And that's regulatory, financial capabilities, and all sorts of things. I'm just sort of conscious of time, but I mean, so this is like, again, work we're doing with Arabs on sort of portfolio structuring. I think one of the big questions that we're finding is many-to-many agreement spaces. So how do you get, we're doing work around climate city contracting. How do you get 1,000 people to agree to transitions? So if policy landscapes are struggling to be able to impose transitions on people, we've got to find an enabling infrastructure for people to be able to come to an agreement in new ways. I think new forms of many-to-many agreement spaces are becoming critical mechanisms in this transition landscape. And actually our ability to construct that is really, really broken right now. So what are these new forms of agreement spaces? And there's a lot of work that we're starting to see around these sorts of agreement models. I think the sort of, I'm coming to a close. I think the boring aspect of that I want to say is that many of the things I've spoken about manifest in boring ways across the everyday world that we live in. So this is not a future that I'm writing, which is saying, right, we've got flying cars and we've got, which I suspect we might have, but it's not a future of that. It's actually the boring sort of aspects of everyday life, everyday capabilities, everyday infrastructure transformations that are required as part of this transition capacity. So it's kind of massive, but micro. And I think that's the scale of the transformation that we're focusing on, is this micro-massive capability. But it also is quite structurally different. And I think, whether we're seeing sort of some of the really interesting work going on in Indigenous communities in Canada, but also in Australia and New Zealand, where the relationship with the world is changing. So there's a lot of work which is looking at how do you start to move away, whether it's the rights of nature, but also a river having its own rights, all the way through to kind of moving beyond ownership as a model of organizing. So the next land economy, when you look at the water hydrological cycle of a piece of land, or the soil, so the carbon sequestered in soil, or the microbiome capacity, how do you start to actually build new ownership discussions around that becomes a key part of this transformation. So whilst it's boring at the material level, I think this is a very interesting transition in terms of a structural worldview shift in that way. So I will end there, hopefully, as part of, and give ourselves a bit of a space for conversation. And hopefully that was mildly provocative enough to sort of invite disagreement. And also just want to preface this to say, this is a worldview coming from our work. And I fully acknowledge that we don't work in what I would say is the middle of the transition cycle. We work on very much on the edges of where people are feeling pain, and being able to work in that cycle. So, yeah. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Indy. That was brilliant, and lots of different things to think over. So we'll move on to questions now. Do feel free to put your hands up or continue to put questions in the chat, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. I guess to kick off, we can go the first question in the chat from Jonathan. Or Andy, do you want to go for that? No, okay, from Jonathan.
Yeah, I thought I might just ask one why people are collecting their thoughts, because there's such an enormous amount of amazing information there. Indy, you said that what we value at the price, what we value and price, I suppose, is that is at the heart of restructuring, the economy. And I suppose when I see what's happening in governments, people are taking action, but it's kind of small iterative change. So how do we make the leap to something fundamentally different in terms of substance and the way that we work? Who exactly could instigate this kind of change, and what kind of government machinery would help make that happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the things that we've been sort of, I suspect we're going to, some of this change and much of this change is going to be crisis driven. So I think we're going to have to look at crisis driven transformation as a key part of this strategy. And that's not because we want to, or that's the desired outcome. I think we are going to be looking at that. So one of the things I would be advocating for is building the crisis response capacity. So almost running a parallel crisis unit that's anticipating critical risks and then looking at what the strategic policy implications. So, how could we have used COVID to retrospectively re-engineer our food systems faster? And what are the strategic risks? And so being able to use the Overton window shifts that crises bring to actually be able to code some of these transitions. So I think crisis is straightforward. I think the other part is this many-to-many problem. I think we have to be able to construct one of the challenges we're finding is, like, say, cities, certainly across Europe, basically don't have the borrowing capacity left, which basically is meaning that their capacity to be able to invest in transition is fundamentally forestalling, even though some of the most interesting cities that you would all know about. And what's becoming very clear is that cities are going to have to build this pooling function of all the asset owners and liability owners. So the aggregation and the pooling of assets and values and liabilities is going to be a key mechanism in organizing transformation. And I think creating the policy architecture for the kind of for this pooling function is going to be really critical, and that's going to be critical for resilience. So the right to pool, flood risk management in a place and be able to pull that together as a shared liability, then to create the hedging instruments. But also, we're going to have to be able to involve a tree planted by a local authority has 50% chance of survival. A tree planted by a community has a 90% chance of survival. So we're also going to have to actually make these public, civic, private partnerships in really radical formats. If I was also making a plea, and Andrew, you're here, so I could make these plea wishes to the government gods, I think we're going to have to reimagine public-private contracting. PPPs have basically become really problematic for lots of good reasons. And I think we're going to need new forms of, and I think it's not even public-private, the lexicon is problematic here, and the language and taxonomy is problematic, but we're going to have to find new contractual arrangements that allow for pooling of liabilities and sharing in different formats, and to be able to get the governance vehicles around that and to be able to make them adjustable, contractable. I think that's going to be a critical piece of work. And I think without that, we're going to forestall on many of the transitions. It's not, the old model was PAP was about private finance. I'm not sure this is about the finance problem. It's about the organization of value around which is held by different actors. So I think there's a whole bunch of things that I think the other thing I would say is the risk, the legibility of risks. I find it often shocking that the speed at which risks are being understood, and also the speed at which the risks are actively being managed. So how do we have fiduciary responsibility more clearly understood and held into, whether it's a departmental lead, understanding those risks and being able to manage them? So how do you build the transparency of risks and strategic risk landscapes? I think it's a really powerful driver of change. And then the other big problem we've got is what I'd call intersectional. All of our solutions have to be intersectional. They have to operate and optimize for multi-solving. And unfortunately, we built industrial government, which is built on silos. So we've got to create an architecture that when silos hit the ground, so when they hit the place, they have to become multi-solving. So I would argue that the NHS, budget should never be able to be used without it also being used for economic development and also being multiplied by environmental health. Right? So you almost make these budgets contingent and multiplying on the ground. Also, it means that government program money has to be fundamentally differently programmed to support coordination and being able to use that dynamically at the ground level in different ways. So I think there's a really interesting question about program and policy money design with intersectional capabilities on the ground, as well as kind of new forms of governance frameworks for how to run that. So that would be my wishes to the, so off the top of my head, as a kind of like opener for one.
Next question from the chat. So Jonathan asked, how do you communicate this to people so that it will drive pressure on politics for action without risking fatalism or overwhelm?
Yeah, it's a really fair point. All I know is that bizarrely, this conversation, I've pretty much had similar conversations already in a community voluntary sector conversation in Plymouth. I've had these conversations on the ground in Birmingham, right, literally on the ground. And what I found interesting, I don't know, it must have been an 80-year-old gentleman walked up to me at the end and said, Indy, I didn't understand everything you said, but you put words into what I was feeling. I thought it was really interesting that actually the civic understanding of this stuff and the capacity to absorb it is much higher than what I would say is the media desire to absorb it. And if I was to be slightly controversial, the Westminster desire to absorb it. So the groundswell conversation is quite different to what I think the kind of London conversation is. And I just want to put that back into the room, that I think we often think the people are not getting this. I think people can feel it. They can feel it in their energy costs. They can feel it in their labor costs. And it's the completeness of the conversation that I think is really critical. I also think there's a really big, and I wrote this slightly controversial paper called Governing Tomorrow, which I'm putting the second one up on LinkedIn. I think there's a really important, what I call governance question here, is how do we believe transition will happen? Will it happen through control and enforcement, or will it happen through enablement and freedom? And what's the architecture of doing, and what hybrid models could be deliver across that? And being really clear about that is going to be a really key bit, because I think one of the big political barriers that I'm seeing is that most people are increasingly feeling trapped in their lives. So that trapture, that capture is making it very difficult for more imposition from government. So we're finding ourselves in this lock where actually we need to change, but actually simultaneously people are captured in the economy, in the way they're living, their taught lives, makes it very difficult to be able to drive that. So there's a new meta conversation to be had about what is the enabling infrastructure of societal transformation, especially for democracies with distributed agency and sovereignty, where sovereignty is not felt at the state level, sovereignty is felt at the citizen level. And I am sovereign, right? And my family is sovereign. And so I think there's something really important here at a philosophical level. The one other point I'd just make is that it'd be great for us. Often I get into rooms and people say, oh, let's not do philosophy, let's just tell me what we should be doing. And I often sort of say, let's not do that. Let's openly engage with what we should be doing with the philosophy, because I think we have to look at engaging and working with these things, because we don't have guardrails for a lot of this work. And so we're going to have to think about the stuff simultaneously. And that's, I think, a key contribution we can make. So, and the other thing I would say is I don't sit with a lack of hope about the future. I actually think that for me, it takes courage to face up into it. But once you face up into it, it's a massive strategic opportunity. I mean, if the UK genuinely faced up into this transformation, you could argue that Brexit has basically broken the UK economy 5 years in advance of everyone else. So 5 years in advance of everyone else, we broke our economy. And the question for us is, how do we rebuild a new economy? And the question is, can we use that 5 years to effectively build the next economy? Our problem, I think, collectively right now is we're not quite into what does that scale of transformation. So I sit with great hope. I think our value and what we value in, Andrew, as you were saying, high nutritious food systems, our ecological infrastructure, collective intelligence, agent-fied societies. I think we're going to see a fundamental shift in where value lies. I mean, one of the projects which we're looking at is, instead of financing individual education, how do you finance the collective intelligence of a city? Just if you look at it that way, you've moved from intelligence being an individual product to being a dialogic, entangled product. And the capability of a city becomes the asset as opposed to individual. And that's a mindset shift in terms of how we're allocating resources and where value is structured in different formats. So I'm actually sitting with a lot of hope, whilst I think it does require us to kind of square into the kind of challenge that we're facing. Sorry, that was a long answer.
So next question from Jeffrey. What capabilities does government need more of and less of in order to meet some of these challenges?
So I think for me, the capacity to, I think where this all came out from was I wrote a slightly controversial post of like evidence-based policy. Yeah, I mean, which was basically, I was challenging the notion of evidence-based policy as the only way to create policy, given the structural nature of the shifts that we're facing. So I think we have to start, and evidence for me has been a proxy of legitimacy, right? It's a sort of proxy. We can do this because it's been done before. Here's the evidence for it, and thereby there's no risk associated with it. It's a sort of a lazy proxy model. And I think what we have to do is, if we're honest about that, and to say that is one dimension of creating legitimacy, and there are other dimensions, I think we've got to be much more clear about layering that out. Evidence is useful in stable environments where historic and future precedents are similar, but when you're talking about such a fundamental transformation, even if you just talk about, an AI, ChatGPT, a 0.3 model will give us PhD level intelligence effectively in the palm of our hands. Right? So when you talk about such a fundamental transformation, I'm not sure evidence-based policy is the only available policy architecture. I think the other thing that I think we're going to have to see in very volatile environments, and this is some work we've been doing, is a move towards a learning-based policy. So what would happen if, for example, if Parliament was to legitimate an outcome, but recognize the means of getting an outcome would be very, very different. But what it would require is the learning audit function of how that policy regime and program was being evolved and understood, and an audit capability. So it's outcome orientated with highly dynamic variability accommodated at the program level or specific policy level. So what does the legislative framework look like? What does the budget frameworks look like when we start to operate that way? I think we're going to need this sort of agile government is like almost a fix for that problem, but I think we need a different policy arc to be able to make these moves at the way that we need to make them. And the other thing that I think we're going to probably end up having to do is look at the role of 100-year trusts and 100-year institutions as a key part of this transition frameworks. So some of these relationships require new type of institutional arrangements because of the timescale of transition that sit outside the role of a single parliament. And so there's something around that.
To take like a couple of ideas across a couple of questions, how I think that it's the kind of the broad idea of how can you take these kind of high level policy thoughts and high level thoughts and communicate them to policy officials, politicians, to kind of lead to practical implementation of change, the change that you kind of want to see, and how can, I guess, designers work with policy teams to help guide that decision making?
I mean, what I see, and again, I'm slightly in a unique place that we don't sit within government, is that many of the politicians want politics constructed for change. What I often hear is, where's the politics for this change? Construct me the politics and I'll stand behind it. And what they're looking for is the construction of the politics of change. And I think that's one of the big things and the politics of change is actually the work that allows a politician to then come in and do their part of the role, which is to take the political seeding that's built and amplify it. And I think that's an invisible part of the work that's really critical. So it's not just information, it's not just technical capacity. It's the active construction of the politics of change with key institutions. And I know civil servants do this all the time, civil servants are beginning to do this, but I think that to me is a really conscious layer of producing any of this work, and to be able to build that everyday politics of change into that. And the other thing I think is really important, and this is something that I'm certainly feeding back into a lot of the work that we're doing, is I often sit in the room and somebody will say, well, look, climate breakdown is going to kill us all, so we've got to worry about that. And I'm like, totally. But if you don't have food on the table today, you're going to be killed in 6 days because you don't have food. So I don't care about 30 days or 300 days or 3,000 days. I care about 6 days. So if segments of the population are operating at different existential risks to their own identity and being, they are not going to have a shared political narrative of the 30-year risk profile. So as we increase inequality, what we'll also do is break the political architecture to deal with these longitudinal risks. And so there's something really important about recognizing that it isn't saying that people are not clever, don't understand it. Actually, they are being appropriate to the logics that they are situationally rooted. And what we have to find is then the policy architecture that scaffolds people who are vulnerable today to be able to operate in the horizons that we need them to also be part of. So there's something really important about this kind of existential risk and landscapes and how we communicate around them.
Thank you. I think we will try and squeeze in one or two more questions. So one from Jennifer from the chat. What is your advice for policymakers who can see they are working to a policy agenda that is entirely misaligned with the global trajectory we are on? She gives the example of working on house building when we might only have the kind of environmental capacity to build a certain number of homes where the government now wants to build over 1 million homes.
Yeah, so I think firstly, so I mean, we did some calculations, about 17,000 homes a year is what the UK can afford to build if it doesn't do retrofit. Just to put some hard numbers around that, right? All of Europe can afford to build 176. So there's a reason why UK is investing into carbon capture, is to create the headroom to be able to do the carbon investment that's required. Right. So if we, there's a sort of logic in play at the systems level around that. So I think for me, what I found helpful is to recognize the goal behind the number, which is spatial justice. What people are saying is we need environments to be more spatially just because this is a real issue for citizens. And then I think what you have to talk about is what's our frameworks of delivering spatial justice, which is the goal behind the proxy. The 1.5 million homes for me, is a proxy for a much more strategic goal because it's a tangible political goal. We use the word cornerstone indicators. They're a sort of a convenient indicator, but actually the deeper goal is spatial justice. And then you have to ask the question, right, how do you build the supply chains? Then you have to ask the question, how do you do that carbon investment in a way that's maximally regenerative? Then you have to start to layer in a whole bunch of work that takes a system beyond that. And I know this is really easy for me to say, so I just don't want to in any way underplay the barriers that I think that was being spoken about. I think that's the best way I've found of navigating it. Not saying it's possible. I know politicians get captured by the numbers they say and so on, and short-term cycles and all those things. And I try not to blame politicians anymore. I think, there's no othering that's useful, frankly, at this moment in time. So, but yeah.
Cool. I think one very last quick question on AI. Is there a role for civic AI for helping civic engagement and coordination?
I think almost certainly. So all of our many-to-many contracting is talking about machine-assisted frameworks. I think that also opens up really critical conversations about governance of these sorts of many-to-many agreement spaces, negotiation spaces, so they don't have inherent bias into them. I think that's the only way democracies deal with the entangled or coordination costs. So if we're looking at a bioregional transformation, currently it takes 5 years to do this community coordination. And we're going to have to massively change that in really radical ways. So a lot of the work that we're doing on many-to-many agreement spaces is exactly rooted in that landscape. And that's also where I was talking about beyond public-private contracting and moving into a new landscape of agreement finding. I think agreement finding is going to be really, and I cannot say, our whole economy has been predicated on the idea of the bilateral private contract. a whole economy of value is constructed in the theory of the bilateral contract. I think technology opens up a landscape of many to many agreements that I think is so conceptually, structurally transformative. I cannot put numbers to it. I think it's almost the dark matter moment from our perspective that changes the theory of how value and price can be organized and the coordination costs can be transformed. So I do think machine learning capabilities are going to be a critical part of that. Massive governance issues, massive kind of issues around that. But I think that's an invitation for us to do something. So anyone wants to collaborate on that, we're doing some work, would love more help and support and collaborate in situations as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Indy. We'll kind of bring things to a close now. That was really, really brilliant. Thank you, Indy. Thank you everyone so much for coming. If you are not a member of the public policy design community, just to plug, Andrew's put some links in the chat to some more details about the community and also all of our past events. I'll share the recording to this after, and it will go online for anyone to watch. And yeah, thanks again, Indy. That was really brilliant. And see you all at the next one. Bye bye.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Indy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was fantastic.